The Galactic Military Academy on Nexus Prime was exactly what you'd expect from a bunch of species who thought marble columns and floating holographic displays were the height of sophistication. Commander Rick Martinez sat in the back row of Advanced Tactical Strategy, trying not to laugh as General Vorthak droned on about the elegant art of warfare, while gesturing with all four of his scaly arms like he was conducting some cosmic orchestra. "Warfare, my dear students," Vorthak announced in that pompous tone that made Rick want to throw something, "is a delicate dance between civilized minds. It requires finesse, patience, and above all, honor." Rick glanced around at his classmates. There was Zeep, the mantis-like Clixarian who took notes with obsessive precision and probably calculated the optimal angle for his pen strokes. Next to him sat Glumar, a gelatinous Blobarian who literally oozed pacifism and kept making soft cooing sounds whenever Vortak mentioned actual combat. And then there was Thrixus, the eagle-headed Raptorian who sat ramrod straight and nodded approvingly at every mention of proper military protocol. They were all so nice, so civilized, so completely unprepared for reality. "Now then," Vorthak continued, his yellow eyes scanning the room with the confidence of someone who'd never actually seen real combat. "Can anyone tell me what separates advanced strategic thinking from mere brute force?" Thrixus's feathers ruffled as she raised a wing. "Superior planning, sir, following established doctrine and maintaining tactical discipline." "Excellent," Vortak beamed. "And you, Zeep?" The insectoid's compound eyes whirred as he processed. "Mathematical precision in resource allocation and predictable enemy response patterns based on historical data, General." "Marvelous. Glumar?" The blob quivered. Maybe we could just talk to them? Share some nice fruit preserves?" Even Vorthak looked pained at that one. His gaze drifted to the back row, where Rick was doing his best impression of someone paying attention. "And our human representative? Surely you have some primitive insight to share." The way he said human made it sound like a particularly unpleasant skin condition. Rick had been putting up with this casual condescension for 3 months now, ever since the Galactic Council had decided that having humans in their fancy military academy would be educational for all species involved. What they really meant was, they wanted to keep an eye on the new kids on the block, the ones who'd managed to go from discovering fire to splitting atoms in a geological blink of an eye. "Oh, I've got insights," Rick said with a grin that made Vortak's scales ripple nervously. "But I wouldn't want to interrupt your fascinating lecture on, what was it? The elegant art of warfare?" Vorthak's forearms twitched slightly. There was something about the human's tone that suggested he found the entire concept amusing, which was deeply unsettling to someone who'd spent decades teaching the refined principles of civilized conflict. "Yes, well," Vorthak cleared his throat, a sound like gravel in a blender. "Perhaps we should move on to practical applications." Rick settled back in his chair, still wearing that innocent smile that somehow managed to look anything but innocent. Around him, his classmates continued taking their meticulous notes, blissfully unaware that they were about to get a crash course in why the rest of the galaxy had started sleeping a little less soundly since humanity had joined the galactic community. The thing was, Rick actually liked his classmates. They were good people, herb beings. They genuinely wanted to learn, they treated warfare like an academic exercise, and they still believed that conflicts could be resolved through proper procedure and mutual respect. It was adorable, really. But Rick had a feeling that was about to change. "Today," Vorthak announced with the kind of dramatic flourish that suggested he'd been practicing in the mirror, "we will test your strategic acumen with a practical exercise." He waved one of his arms at the massive holographic display that materialized in the center of the room, showing a detailed tactical scenario that looked like something out of a military textbook. "Behold, Fortress Impregnable!" Rick snorted softly. Of course they'd named it Fortress Impregnable, because subtlety was apparently another human concept that hadn't made it to the galactic curriculum. "Your mission," Vorthak continued, pacing around the hologram with theatrical precision, "is to devise a strategy to capture this heavily fortified enemy position. As you can see, it features state-of-the-art defensive systems, multiple redundant shield generators, and a garrison of highly trained defenders. The terrain provides no obvious tactical advantages, and orbital bombardment is not an option due to civilian populations in the surrounding area." Thrixus immediately started scribbling notes with the intensity of someone taking a final exam. Zeep's compound eyes were already scanning the display, calculating trajectories and resource requirements. Even Glumar had stopped cooing and was studying the fortress with what might have been concentration. "Who would like to present first?" Vortak asked, clearly expecting a volunteer. Thrixis's wings shot up so fast she nearly took flight. "I volunteer, General. A proper siege operation following established protocols should suffice. We establish a perimeter, cut off supply lines, and wait for surrender through gradual attrition. Estimated time frame 6 to 8 months with minimal casualties on both sides." "Textbook approach," Vortak nodded approvingly. "Zeep." The insectoid clicked excitedly. "Mathematical analysis indicates optimal solution involves precision strikes on 17 key structural points, resulting in systematic defensive collapse within 72 hours. Collateral damage calculations show acceptable parameters within galactic warfare conventions. Excellent technical application. And Glumar?" The blob jiggled thoughtfully. "Well, what if we sent them a really nice gift basket first? Maybe some of those sparkly crystals from Andromeda 7? And then we could explain very politely why they should consider relocating. I'm sure they're reasonable people." Vortak's expression suggested he was reconsidering his career choices. "That's creative, Glumar. Very diplomatic." All three solutions were perfectly reasonable by galactic standards. Honorable, civilized, and designed to minimize casualties while following proper military etiquette. Rick had to admit, if he'd been facing any normal galactic species, these approaches might actually work. But normal was never really humanity's strong suit. "And what about our human student?" Vortak asked, his tone making it clear he expected nothing useful. "Surely Commander Martinez has some input to offer." Rick looked up from where he'd been apparently daydreaming. "Oh, you want me to take a crack at it?" "If you think you're capable," Vortak said with barely concealed condescension. "Though I understand if this level of strategic thinking is beyond your species' current development." Rick's grin got a little wider, a little sharper. Around him, his classmates exchanged glances. They'd gotten used to their human classmate being quietly amused by everything, but something about his expression right now was making them vaguely uncomfortable. "Sure, I'll give it a shot," Rick said, standing up and stretching like he was about to tackle a particularly easy crossword puzzle. "Fair warning, though, I tend to think a little outside the box." He walked toward the holographic display with the casual confidence of someone who'd done this sort of thing before. Many times before. The way he studied the fortress layout wasn't like his classmates' careful academic analysis. It was more like a predator examining prey. "This should be fun," Rick said, cracking his knuckles. Rick walked up to the holographic display and started manipulating it with the casual ease of someone who'd spent way too much time staring at tactical scenarios. The fortress rotated slowly as he examined it from every angle, and for a moment, his classmates thought maybe he was going to present something normal after all. "All right," Rick said, pointing at the main gate. "So we've got your standard defensive setup here. Multiple overlapping fields of fire, redundant shield systems, excellent sightlines. Whoever designed this knew what they were doing." He paused, tilting his head. "From a conventional standpoint, anyway." Vortak nodded approvingly. "Yes, it's considered a masterpiece of defensive architecture by galactic standards." "Oh, I'm sure it is," Rick agreed, and something in his tone made Thrixis's feathers ruffle nervously. "But here's the thing about masterpieces. They're predictable." Rick started drawing on the holographic display, adding his own tactical annotations. At first, it looked reasonable enough. Troop movements, supply lines, the kind of standard approach you'd expect from any competent military officer. "So phase 1, Rick continued cheerfully. "We establish what appears to be a conventional siege perimeter. Nothing fancy, just your basic textbook encirclement. We make a big show of setting up artillery positions, digging trenches, the whole 9 yards. Really sell the idea that we're planning a long, drawn-out siege." Zeep clicked approvingly. "Standard misdirection tactics. Logical opening gambit." "Right?" Rick grinned. "Except while we're making all that noise, we're actually doing something completely different." His stylus danced across the display, adding new elements that made his classmates lean forward in confusion. "See, while the enemy's focused on our big, obvious siege preparations, we're infiltrating their supply network 3 months before we even show up." "Wait," Thraxel interrupted. 3 months before? How do you infiltrate before you attack?" "Oh, that's easy," Rick said with the same tone someone might use to explain how to boil water. "You don't infiltrate during wartime, you infiltrate during peacetime, much easier when nobody's expecting it." The room got very quiet. "We identify key suppliers, shipping companies, maintenance contractors. Rick continued, adding more lines and markers to his display. We don't sabotage anything at first. That would be too obvious. Instead, we just make friends. Become reliable business partners. Maybe we offer better rates, faster service, higher quality goods. Glumar quivered uncertainly. That sounds almost nice? Oh, it is nice, Rick agreed. Right up until the moment we activate our sleeper network and suddenly every food shipment is contaminated with mild laxatives, every spare parts delivery is mysteriously delayed, and every maintenance crew is asking way too many questions about defensive systems. Vorthak's scales had gone from their usual green to a distinctly uncomfortable yellow. That seems unusually complex for what should be a straightforward military exercise. Complex? Rick laughed. We're just getting started. While our fake siege is keeping them busy and our supply network sabotage is making them miserable, we're launching Phase 3. He drew new arrows on the display, these ones pointing in completely unexpected directions. Psychological warfare. The way he said it made it sound like he was discussing the weather. See, the thing about fortress defenders is they're used to direct threats. Armies at the gates, ships in orbit, that kind of obvious stuff. They're not used to their children's teachers starting to ask uncomfortable questions about daddy's work. They're not used to their favorite restaurant suddenly being out of their favorite dish every time they visit. They're not used to their personal communication devices randomly playing the sound of crying babies at 3 in the morning. Zeep's compound eyes had stopped whirring. In fact, they'd gone completely still, which, for a Clixarian, was usually a sign of deep concern. Deep concern. You would target civilians? Thrixis asked, her voice pitched higher than usual. Target? Rick looked genuinely confused. Who said anything about targeting? I'm talking about environmental adjustment, atmospheric pressure modification, subliminal motivation enhancement. He paused, considering. Okay, the crying baby thing might be a little on the nose, but the psychological impact studies on sleep deprivation are really quite fascinating. He turned back to the display, adding even more layers to his plan. Each new element seemed perfectly reasonable when explained in isolation, but taken together they formed a web of complexity that was starting to make everyone in the room deeply uncomfortable. Now, by week 4 of the siege, the defenders are tired, paranoid, and starting to make mistakes. Their supply lines are unreliable, their families are asking awkward questions, and they haven't had a good night's sleep in a month. That's when we launch Phase 4. Rick's stylus moved across the display with practiced efficiency, adding what looked like retreat arrows. We run away. The silence in the room was deafening. You retreat? Vorthak asked slowly. Full tactical withdrawal, Rick confirmed cheerfully. Pack up our siege equipment, recall our forces, send a message apologizing for the misunderstanding and offering to pay for any inconvenience caused. But, Zeep's voice sounded strained, that makes no tactical sense whatsoever. Rick's grin got wider. Doesn't it, though? The silence stretched until Thrixis finally found her voice. I don't understand. You spend months preparing, lay siege, implement all these disturbing tactics, and then you just leave? Oh, we leave all right, Rick said, manipulating the holographic display to show his retreat routes. But here's the beautiful part about human psychology versus, well, everyone else's psychology. When we retreat, we leave behind little gifts. He started adding new markers to the display. Small, innocuous-looking dots scattered throughout the fortress and surrounding area. Listening devices? Vorthak guessed, leaning forward despite himself. Some of them, Rick agreed. But that's amateur hour stuff. No, the real gifts are much more creative. We leave behind evidence. Evidence of what? Glumar asked, though her usual cheerful gurgling had taken on a distinctly worried tone. Rick's expression didn't change, but there was something in his eyes now that made the room feel several degrees cooler. Evidence of betrayal. See, during our months of friendly business relationships, we've been very carefully documenting every interaction, every meeting, every communication, every financial transaction, and some of those documents might accidentally get left where certain security forces might find them. Zeep's mandibles clicked rapidly, a sure sign of extreme agitation. You would frame innocent civilians as collaborators? Frame is such an ugly word, Rick said, adding more details to his display. I prefer the term contextual reinterpretation of existing facts. Besides, they're not entirely innocent. They did take our money and provide services. The fact that they didn't know they were helping us just makes the evidence more convincing. Borthak's forearms were now twitching, and what Rick had learned was the Drakmarian equivalent of a nervous breakdown. But that would destroy their lives, their families, their careers, their social standing. Collateral damage, Rick shrugged. But don't worry, it gets better. Because while the Fortress defenders are dealing with a paranoid internal investigation trying to root out collaborators who may or may not exist, we launch Phase 5. The holographic display expanded to show a much larger operational area, with movement patterns that made everyone in the room deeply uncomfortable. We hit 3 other targets simultaneously. Other targets, Thrixis squawked, her feathers now standing completely on end. Supply depots, communication hubs, military installations, Rick listed casually, marking each one on the display. Nothing directly connected to our original objective, you understand. These are just coincidental military operations happening in the same general timeframe. Rick's stylus moved with practiced efficiency, showing attack vectors and timing sequences that demonstrated a level of coordination that shouldn't have been possible with the resources they'd been given for the exercise. How? Zeep managed to ask. The scenario parameters clearly stated, limited resources, single target engagement. Oh, those resources, Rick chuckled. Yeah, see, that's another difference between human and galactic strategic thinking. You guys plan for the scenario you're given. We plan for the scenario we want. He pointed to several markers on the display. These 3 attacks aren't using our assigned resources. These are funded and equipped by what I like to call alternative acquisition methods. Theft, Vorthak said flatly. Aggressive resource reallocation, Rick corrected. Plus some creative accounting with our earlier business relationships. Amazing how much military equipment you can buy when you've got insider information on shipping schedules and security protocols. Glumar made a sound that might have been whimpering. But the casualties, innocent people? Minimal, Rick assured her, though his definition of minimal was apparently very different from everyone else's. I mean, we're not monsters. We give everyone at least 30 seconds warning before we blow things up. 45 seconds if there are children present. The room had gone completely silent except for the soft humming of the holographic display. Rick seemed oblivious to the growing horror on his classmates' faces as he continued adding layers of complexity to his plan. Now, here's where it gets really interesting, he continued with genuine enthusiasm. While everyone's scrambling to respond to our multi-front assault, trying to figure out how we coordinated all this, trying to root out the collaborators in their own ranks, we launch the final phase. He zoomed the display back to the original fortress, but now it looked different somehow. More vulnerable. The defensive positions that had seemed so impregnable at the start now looked like exactly what they were. Static targets. We come back. Back? Vorthak's voice had risen to a pitch that suggested his species' fight-or-flight response was strongly leaning toward flight. With a completely different force composition, using completely different tactics, hitting completely different objectives, Rick explained cheerfully. See, by now they've adapted their defenses to counter our original siege tactics. They've repositioned their forces to protect against the kind of infiltration and psychological warfare we used before. They're expecting us to try the same thing again. Rick drew new attack vectors that bypassed every defensive position he'd originally identified. So we don't. Instead, we hit them with a straightforward, honest, completely conventional orbital bombardment. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. But you said orbital bombardment wasn't an option, Thrixis whispered. The civilian populations... Rick's smile didn't waver, but somehow it had become the most terrifying expression anyone in the room had ever seen. That was before we evacuated them. Evacuated them? Glumar's voice was barely audible. During our psychological warfare phase, Rick explained with the patience of a teacher addressing particularly slow students. All those uncomfortable questions, all those inconvenient disruptions, all that general anxiety about living near a military target? Turns out that's very effective motivation for voluntary relocation. Amazing how many people decide to visit relatives in other star systems when their daily routine becomes sufficiently unpleasant. Zeep's compound eyes had gone completely dark, which for a Clixarian was the equivalent of covering your face with your hands. You manipulated innocent civilians into abandoning their homes so you could destroy them without moral constraints? I prefer to think of it as providing them with sufficient information to make informed lifestyle choices, Rick said. But hey, potato. The silence that followed was the kind of silence that occurs when everyone in a room simultaneously realizes they've been sharing space with something that might be fundamentally different from them, on a level they'd never considered before. Rick looked around at their expressions with what appeared to be genuine confusion. Is there a problem? Because I've got backup plans for the backup plans, if you want to hear those too. Vorthak had gone completely silent, which for a Drakmarian was usually a sign that their brain was processing something too large to compute. When he finally spoke, his voice had dropped to barely above a whisper. Commander Martinez, I need to understand something. In your plan, you mentioned that evacuating the civilians would remove moral constraints on orbital bombardment. Are you suggesting that the presence of innocence is the only thing preventing you from using maximum force? Rick blinked, genuinely surprised by the question. Well, yeah, I mean, we're not psychopaths, General. We don't kill people just for fun. But if they're not there anymore... He shrugged, with the casual indifference of someone discussing whether to use regular or premium gasoline. Then it's just property damage. Just property damage? Thrixes repeated in a voice that sounded like she was trying to convince herself she'd heard wrong. Right, Rick confirmed, warming to his theme. See, this is what I love about this exercise. It really highlights the fundamental difference between human strategic thinking and, well, everyone else's. He gestured at the holographic display, which now looked less like a tactical scenario and more like a blueprint for systematic psychological destruction. When you guys look at this fortress, you see a military objective that needs to be captured according to proper protocols. You think about honor and rules of engagement and minimizing casualties on both sides. Rick's tone was genuinely admiring, like he was praising them for a quaint cultural tradition. When I look at it, I see a problem that needs to be solved as efficiently as possible. Zeep's mandibles had stopped clicking entirely, which was deeply unsettling for a species that communicated as much through sound as through words. But the methods you describe, the psychological manipulation, the betrayal of trust, the systematic destruction of social bonds, these are not merely military tactics. These are attacks on the fundamental structures that hold civilized society together. Exactly, Rick said with genuine enthusiasm, apparently missing the horror in Zeep's voice entirely. That's what makes them so effective. See, most species develop warfare as an extension of their existing social structures. You fight the way you live, honorably, with respect for established hierarchies, following agreed-upon rules. Rick walked over to the display and started highlighting different aspects of his plan, with the enthusiasm of a professor giving his favorite lecture. But humans didn't have that luxury. We've been fighting each other for our entire evolutionary history. We've had wars that lasted decades, wars that consumed entire continents, wars where the primary objective was to make the other side stop existing as a functional civilization. His stylus danced across the hologram, adding historical references that made everyone in the room deeply uncomfortable. We've perfected the art of turning enemy strengths into weaknesses. Strong family bonds? Excellent. Now we have leverage and pressure points. Rigid military hierarchy? Perfect. Corrupt or eliminate a few key officers and the whole structure collapses. Deep cultural traditions? Wonderful, we can either exploit them for predictable behavior patterns or systematically destroy them to break morale. Gulmar made a sound that was definitely whimpering now. But why would you want to do such things? What could possibly be worth destroying everything that makes life worth living? Rick paused, his stylus hovering over the display, and for the first time since he'd started his presentation, his expression became completely serious. Survival, he said simply. See, that's the thing you have to understand about human military doctrine. We don't fight wars to prove points, or settle disputes, or maintain honor. We fight wars to win them. And winning means making absolutely certain that the other side can never threaten us again. He turned back to face the class, and something in his posture had changed. The casual, almost playful demeanor was still there, but underneath it was something much older and infinitely more dangerous. Every single tactic I've described has been used in human conflicts. The long-term infiltration, the psychological warfare, the manipulation of civilian populations, the systematic destruction of enemy infrastructure and social cohesion. We've been refining these techniques for thousands of years, passing them down through generations of military theorists who understood that the only thing worse than winning ugly is losing pretty. Vorthak's forearms were trembling now, though whether from fear or anger was impossible to tell. But the cost, the innocent people caught in the middle, how do you justify the collateral damage? Rick's expression didn't change, but his voice carried the weight of every human conflict that had ever been fought. We don't justify it, General. We calculate it. We weigh the immediate cost against the long-term consequences. We ask ourselves what happens if we lose, what happens if we show mercy to an enemy who might not show mercy to us, what happens if we fight honorably against an opponent who fights to exterminate us. He gestured at the display again, where his multi-layered plan continued to spin in all its terrifying complexity. Every human military academy teaches a fundamental principle that I don't think exists in galactic strategic doctrine. It is better to be monstrous and victorious than honorable and extinct. The room had gone so quiet that the soft humming of the holographic projectors sounded like screaming. But that's just the military side, Rick continued with a return to his earlier cheerful tone, apparently oblivious to the fact that everyone in the room looked like they'd just witnessed their first glimpse into the abyss. The real genius of human warfare isn't tactical, it's strategic. We don't just plan to win the current war, we plan to prevent the next one. He added new elements to the display, showing post-conflict scenarios that were somehow even more disturbing than the warfare itself. See, after we've systematically destroyed the enemy's military capacity, social structure, and will to resist, we don't just pack up and go home. We stay. We help them rebuild, but we rebuild them our way. We integrate their surviving population into our economic systems. We educate their children in our schools. We make sure that in 20 years the idea of fighting us again isn't just militarily impossible, it's psychologically inconceivable. Rixus's voice came out as barely a whisper. You conquer their minds. We liberate their potential, Rick corrected gently. Look at Earth's history. How many ancient enemies are now our closest allies? How many cultures that once fought us to the death now consider themselves part of human civilization? We don't destroy our enemies, we transform them into us. Rick stepped back from the display and looked around at his classmates with what appeared to be genuine affection. And that's why I really like you guys. You're not enemies, you're future humans who just haven't realized it yet. The silence that followed was the kind of silence that occurs when everyone in a room simultaneously realizes that the friendly, slightly goofy human they'd been sitting next to for 3 months might actually be the most terrifying thing they'd ever encountered. The silence stretched on until it became almost physically painful. Vorthak was staring at the holographic display like it might suddenly spring to life and start implementing itself. Zeep had gone into what appeared to be a defensive posture, his compound eyes scanning for exits. Thrix's feathers were so ruffled she looked like she'd been struck by lightning, and Glumar had actually started to solidify around the edges, which for a Blobarian was the equivalent of building a panic room. Rick looked around at all of them with growing concern. Seriously, is everyone okay? You all look like you've seen a ghost or something. He paused, considering. Did I explain something wrong? Because I can go over the orbital bombardment calculations again if that would help. The math is actually pretty straightforward, once you factor in atmospheric density and structural stress tolerances. Vortak made a sound that might have been a whimper if Drakmarians were capable of such things. Commander Martinez, I think perhaps we should, that is, maybe we've covered enough tactical theory for one day. Already? Rick glanced at the chronometer on the wall with genuine disappointment. But we haven't even gotten to the interesting part yet. That was just Plan B. The temperature in the room seemed to drop another 10 degrees. Plan B? Thrixus managed to croak. Yeah, obviously, Rick said, as if this should have been clear from the beginning. I mean, what kind of military planner only has one strategy? Plan B is for when you're dealing with a more sophisticated enemy, someone who might actually expect psychological warfare and long-term infiltration tactics. He turned back to the holographic display with renewed enthusiasm, apparently oblivious to the fact that everyone else in the room had gone completely rigid with terror. Plan A is much more direct. See, if we're really pressed for time, we just identify the fortress commander's family members, kidnap them during the first week, and then send him recordings of them asking very politely for Daddy to surrender. Works about 90% of the time, and the whole operation wraps up in under a month. Glumar made a sound like air escaping from a punctured balloon. Of course, Plan A has some drawbacks, Rick continued thoughtfully. Higher immediate psychological trauma for enemy personnel, more complicated extraction logistics, and you really have to be careful about the recordings. Too threatening, and you harden their resolve. Too gentle, and they don't take it seriously. It's all about finding that sweet spot between desperate concern and absolute terror. Zeep's mandibles clicked once, very softly, and then went silent again. Then there's Plan C, which is basically Plan B, but we start with orbital bombardment and work backwards. Much faster, but you lose a lot of the psychological intelligence-gathering opportunities. Plan D involves bioweapons, but that's generally considered overkill for a simple fortress assault. Plan E is the one where we convince them their own allies are planning to betray them, which is actually pretty fun but requires a lot of prep work. How many plans do you have? Vorthak interrupted, his voice pitched higher than anyone had ever heard it. Rick paused, apparently counting in his head. For this specific scenario? Probably around 15 or 20, depending on how you classify the variants. But that's pretty standard for any engagement. You always want to have multiple options available, depending on changing circumstances, enemy capabilities, available resources, acceptable casualty rates. He trailed off, finally seeming to notice that everyone in the room was staring at him with expressions that fell somewhere between horror and fascination. Are you guys not taught contingency planning in galactic military doctrine? Because that would explain a lot about some of the strategic decisions I've been seeing in the case studies. Vorthak cleared his throat, a sound like grinding gears. We do learn about backup strategies, yes, but perhaps not quite so comprehensively? Huh? Rick said, genuinely puzzled. That's weird. How do you handle situations where your primary strategy fails catastrophically, or when the enemy does something completely unexpected, or when your initial intelligence turns out to be wrong, or when political considerations change mid-conflict, or when... We adapt, Thrixus interrupted quickly, apparently desperate to stop the flow of questions that were revealing just how unprepared galactic military doctrine was for the kind of comprehensive strategic thinking Rick considered basic. Adapt, Rick repeated slowly, as if testing the concept. Like, you just wing it? We improvise, based on established tactical principles and command experience, Zeep said stiffly. Rick stared at him for a long moment, then started laughing. Not the polite chuckle of someone being socially appropriate, but genuine, helpless laughter that suggested he found something absolutely hilarious. Oh man, he gasped between laughs. No wonder the Galactic Council was so eager to have humans as allies instead of enemies. You guys have been flying by the seat of your pants this whole time. The laughter continued for another few seconds before Rick got himself under control, wiping tears from his eyes. Sorry, it's not funny. It's actually kind of sweet, in a terrifying way. You've all been fighting wars like they're sporting events, with rules and referees and the expectation that everyone's going to play fair. His expression softened with what might have been genuine affection. That's actually really admirable. Naive as hell, but admirable. Vorthak had been making notes throughout Rick's presentation, but now he quietly closed his datapad and looked around at his students with the expression of someone who had just realized his entire worldview needed extensive revision. Class dismissed, he said quietly. Already? Rick protested. But we didn't even get to the part about post-conflict psychological rehabilitation programs. Those are really interesting, especially the techniques for helping enemy survivors integrate into your society without developing long-term resistance movements. There's this whole branch of strategic planning dedicated to making sure your former enemy's children grow up thinking of you as the good guys. But his classmates were already gathering their things, with the desperate efficiency of people fleeing a natural disaster. Zeep actually knocked over his chair in his haste to reach the door. Thrixus was making soft keening sounds under her breath, as she stuffed her notes into her bag. Glumar had resumed her liquid state and was essentially flowing toward the exit. Within 30 seconds, the classroom was empty except for Rick and Vorthak. Did I say something wrong? Rick asked, looking around at the abandoned classroom with genuine confusion. Because I thought that went pretty well, very educational. Vorthak stared at him for a long moment, his yellow eyes reflecting what might have been a mixture of fear, respect, and profound existential uncertainty. Commander Martinez, he said finally, I think perhaps in the future our tactical exercises might benefit from smaller groups, more intimate discussions, possibly with additional security personnel present. Security personnel? Rick's eyebrows rose. General, are you worried about something? Vorthak looked at the holographic display, which was still showing Rick's multi-layered assault plan in all its terrifying detail, then back at the human who had created it, with the casual ease of someone doodling in the margins of a notebook. Commander Martinez, he said carefully, I'm beginning to understand why humans have been invited to fewer and fewer joint strategic planning sessions since joining the Galactic Council. Rick's face lit up with genuine pleasure. Oh, you heard about that? Yeah, it's been happening a lot lately. Apparently our ideas make some of the other species uncomfortable or question their fundamental assumptions about the nature of civilized warfare, or some such nonsense. He shrugged cheerfully. But hey, their loss, right? As Rick packed up his things and headed for the door, whistling what sounded like an ancient human military march, Vorthak remained standing in the empty classroom, staring at the holographic display and wondering if maybe, just maybe, The Galactic Council's policy of keeping humans as allies rather than enemies wasn't just diplomatically wise, but a matter of survival. After all, if this was what human strategic thinking looked like when they were being friendly and educational, he really didn't want to find out what it looked like when they were trying to win.